focus within Bristol and in other cities in the UK is about building dementia-friendly communities. And we want to create inclusive, supportive communities, not just within care settings, but across cities and across all aspects of city infrastructure. So today's focus, we're really delighted to bring together 3 experts who are going to speak to different aspects of research and practice initiatives under this theme about reimagining what dementia care could look like. So we have Richard Ward from Stirling University, Stuart Wright from Brunelcare, and Emily Dodd from the University of West of England. So each speaker, Stuart and Richard, are going to speak for about 20 minutes each. And then we have a 10-minute...
Passengers will arrive in Taiwan.
Oh, there we go. And then we also have a 10-minute recorded presentation from Emily Dodd, who unfortunately can't be with us in person today. But thankfully, we're able to share some of her work through that recording. And then we'll have time for question and answer and general discussion amongst the group. If you have any questions that spring to mind as the presenters are going through their work, feel free to pop it in the chat box so that they can see it and everybody can see the comments and queries, and we can come back to those towards the end. So without any further ado, I'm going to welcome our first speaker. Our first speaker is Dr. Richard Ward from the University of Stirling. Richard is a senior lecturer in dementia studies at the university and head of division for global aging and dementia. He's a registered social worker specializing in working with older people living with dementia. His research interests include social care practice, the experience of living with dementia, and how place-based experience can influence the lives of people with chronic and progressive conditions. He's part of a network of academics with a shared interest in studying the international development of dementia-friendly communities. He's co-founder of the Critical Dementia Studies Network and is publishing on Introduction to Critical Dementia Studies later this year, which will be an edited collection of contributors from around the world. And he's going to talk to us about thinking temporally about dementia and neighborhood-based support. So Richard, a really big welcome. Thank you. And I'll hand the floor over to you.
Thank you, Paul. Okay, folks, if you could bear with me while I try and share my screen with you. Okay, can everyone see that? Yeah.
Great.
Okay, well, first of all, thank you very much to Paul and to Jennifer and everyone at the Bristol Research Forum on Aging for inviting me along to speak today, and in particular to speak to this kind of broader theme of reimagining dementia care, because this is a topic that for me is really important. I think that if we've learned anything from the recent pandemic, it's really that there is a need to radically rethink the way that we do dementia care, the way it's structured, and to reimagine how it's being delivered. And Patty Laver, who's a feminist ethnographer, has suggested that to be a good critical researcher, what you need to do is take what's presented as a problem, take what's presented as a solution, and treat it as a problem. And part of what I want to argue today is that perhaps some of the problems and the origin and nature of the problems facing dementia care aren't so much to do with the care itself, but actually to do with the context and the conditions in which that care is being provided. So essentially what I want to do is talk about time today as a fairly neglected aspect of the experience of dementia and of the experience of dementia care. I'm going to draw partly on a study that I led recently looking at neighbourhoods and dementia. I'm not going to say too much about the detail of the project, but I've included a list of outputs at the end of this presentation for anyone who wants to follow up on any detail of the project. But essentially what I would like to do is just say something very briefly about the context, the research and the context of dementia care, to share with you some of the key findings in respect to what we learned about people's experiences, particularly of accessing formal dementia care and support, and then outline just a handful of initial recommendations. And that's where I'd like to hear your own thoughts and your own ideas.
Listen without looking at the recommendations.
Okay, so before I start, I just wanted to say something, first of all, very briefly about time itself, because the title of this presentation, Duration Not Difference, is a quote taken from work by Lisa Baretza. One of the things that Baretza is arguing, along with a number of commentators on time and temporality, is that we need to move beyond thinking of time as simply a kind of a singular, lineal, chronological kind of abstract unit of measure, and actually start thinking about time as something that that is embodied and material, and something that structures our day-to-day lives and our relationships with other people, including our relationships with institutions, care providers, the state, and that kind of thing. And that emphasis on duration rather than difference is a call by Baretza to really think about a very fluid, emerging, negotiated way of social relationships, rather than kind of fixed categories of identity, which is usually what we tend to focus upon, not only in research and in policy, but also, of course, in practice. So just a few words, first of all, about the context, because dementia care itself is very fluid. It's shifting all the time. Probably one of the biggest changes that we've witnessed in recent years has been a migration of care from institutionalized settings to support in the community. And there's three areas of research that's kind of grown up around that. In part, looking at the relationship of people with dementia to their physical environment, and particularly the role that design can play in enabling people and supporting independence for people with dementia. Another area of research evidence is around people's experience of the social environment, and ongoing international evidence of social exclusion, discrimination, and stigma that's faced by people with dementia in public spaces. Although our research has also begun to suggest that the visibility of people with dementia, their preparedness to kind of challenge some of these attitudes, is actually having a big impact upon the nature and constitution of civic spaces. And then another area concerns the different needs that people might have when they're living in a community environment compared to an institutionalized environment, but also significant evidence of unmet need, particularly a deficit in support around kind of day-to-day challenges of managing the home, managing finances, finding opportunities for sociability, that kind of thing. But what's kind of missing from this picture at the moment is any kind of critical attention to the role of time and temporality. And what I want to do in the course of this presentation is just kind of suggest that we need to maybe more explicitly consider the role that time has in the relationship that people have to their communities when they're living with a condition like dementia. So just a very quick word about the neighbourhoods and dementia study that I was involved with recently. I just wanted to say something about the temporal aspect of our design, because we had a kind of a longitudinal aspect to the research where we interviewed people using a mix of methods and then returned to them after about 8 to 12 months, just to try and map some of the changes that people had experienced over that period of time. We ended up with over 300 in-depth interviews with people with dementia and their care partners. So it's quite a substantial kind of body of qualitative data and evidence that we're drawing upon in terms of the findings that have come from this study. And perhaps unsurprisingly, what we found was that time was relevant to every domain of people's lives. I mean, it was a crucial feature of day-to-day living. And what I want to do in this paper is just pull out three of the key themes that relate particularly to experiences of access and use of formal care and support across three areas. First of all, people's use of time, how they occupied themselves and their time management, people's what we call temporal autonomy, so their control over the time and the timings of receipt of care and that kind of thing. And then this broader issue around temporal worth and the question of how people's time is valued relative to other people and to providers who are providing care and the local authorities that they're engaging with. So just a few words, first of all, about people's use of time, because one of the key findings of this study was that even though people with dementia and their care partners spend a great deal of time together, they have a really starkly different experience, lived experience of time itself. So for many of the people with dementia that we spoke to, their challenge was how do they fill time? Lots of people talked about having very reduced opportunities for engaging in kind of meaningful activities on a day-to-day basis, but also challenges around synchronizing their time with the free time of other people. So quite a few people talked about in their local neighborhood, their friends and their neighbors disappearing during the course of the day off to work or getting on with whatever they're doing that day, and the person with dementia being left feeling fairly isolated and underoccupied, remaining in the neighborhood. But from the point of view of care partners, it was an almost opposite kind of situation of feeling a real press of time, having little, if any, kind of free time for themselves. A lot of people talked about having to juggle competing demands on their time, and also struggling to find time to invest in other relationships. So keeping those kind of wider support networks connected to their own lives. And I think that what these findings tell us is that they perhaps, if not offering a baseline, they offer us certain criteria by which to judge the impact of formal care. So if people are accessing formal care, is it doing anything to actually provide opportunities for more day-to-day engagement and company for people with dementia? But is it also doing much to relieve those time pressures that so many of the carers that we were talking to were experiencing? Perhaps one of the key issues that arose from our conversations with people was around this issue of temporal autonomy. So that question of people having control over time, being able to make decisions about when and how things happened in their lives. And one of the things that we learned very quickly about accessing formal care was that it was actually service providers who were making a lot of these temporalized decisions. So things about when a service would start, when a service would end, the duration of that service, the frequency of that service, were all things that were taken out of the hands of the person with dementia and their care partner and were being made by a service provider. And perhaps one of the clearest illustrations of that was around the issue of the undertiming of care. So a lot of people, particularly around home care, talked about the struggle for their needs to be met in the time that was being allocated to them for a home care visit. So home care workers were focusing quite narrowly upon what you might describe as activities of daily living, getting somebody up and about and dressed and eating their breakfast. But actually there was very little time for things like sociability, for people to actually be able to get out of the home, so that it was compounding their sense of isolation within the home. From the point of view of care partners, what we found is that many carers were facing what we call time penalties. So accessing formal care meant that they were paying these kind of penalties through having their time taken away from them. And a good example of that was the amount of time that they were investing in having to induct new workers on a fairly regular basis who had very little prior information about the person they were caring for. But also things like having to fill in for missed visits, having to fill in when somebody arrived late or left early, and also the kind of background work that they were doing, kind of brokering between different services. So it was actually the care partners a lot of the time who were spending their time liaising between the third sector and the public sector and making sure payments were made and things like this. So overall, there was actually very little evidence that access to formal care was improving opportunities for time use by people with dementia, or that it was relieving the time pressures for care partners. And actually, these are quite important considerations, because I think if COVID has taught us one thing, what we know is that absence of opportunities for sociability for people with dementia can really hasten the progression and the severity of their condition. And we know from long-standing research around the experience of care partners that exhaustion is one of the key factors that lead to the admission of people with dementia into long-stay care. So these aren't kind of peripheral considerations; they're really central to people being able to sustain their caring relationships in the community. So I just wanted to say a little bit about the background to the research, because this provides a bit of a context to what we were learning. We were doing our interviews between 2016, 2018, and that was really coming at the end of an initial extended period of austerity policy that was impacting particularly on adult social care budgets. And we were in effect kind of through our interviewing seeing the kind of lived outcomes of some of this policy, how it was impacting on people's day-to-day lives. One of the key areas was around incremental rationing of support to people with dementia. So even though dementia is a progressive condition, people's needs extend over time, what we were learning is that the amount of time that they were being allocated for support was being whittled away and reduced, often based upon a changed classification of their status as a service user. And the impact that this was having was quite noticeable also on wider informal support networks. So as formal care was kind of retreating, so the pressure was on informal support networks to step in and fill the gap. So there was increasing pressure on already fairly precarious relationships with a wider support network for people with dementia and the carers. And I guess one of the key things that we were learning is that time itself has become a really key arena for this struggle over care and support, and this struggle for people to kind of realize a reasonable degree of well-being and quality of life when they're living in the community. So the last thing that I just wanted to pull out very quickly relates to this, what we've called temporal worth. And one of the things that Lisa Baretza talks about is that there are socially, there's kind of certain ways of using time that are much more given much more esteem, much more valued. For example, when somebody has a very sped up use of time that leads to a very clear kind of product at the end of it, that's something that we kind of value socially. But people who have experiences of time where time drags, for example, if you're living with a chronic illness, or where there's no kind of physical output or product to what you're doing, which is the case for many care partners, then those are kinds of uses of time that tend to be quite devalued in our society. One of the things we learned was that there were lots of messages being sent through the care system to people with dementia about that devaluing of their time, whether it was not being able to get hold of a worker when they were trying to get a response to a request for support, trying to get a decision for some aspect of their care. The message that was coming back to people was that their time was undervalued by comparison to that of the provider. One of the key areas where we saw that playing out was in relation to people's experiences of waiting, which was almost universally experienced by everyone accessing dementia care, but also shared by other service user groups in the context of an austerity hit health and social care. And it's actually been argued that waiting is almost a conscious, deliberate thing to remind people of their low temporal worth. But I think what we found in our research was that it led sometimes to really uncomfortable, embodied, subjective experiences of time. People who are in this kind of situation of stasis and liminality, not really knowing what was going to happen, not knowing whether a decision was going to go in their way, waiting for decisions, for example, around benefits or the beginning of a service. So they were kind of carrying this kind of embodied weight of uncertainty because of the delays and the dominance of service time that they were facing. But it also led to quite stark kind of material outcomes for people as well. I mean, this quote is from Jo, whose partner moved into residential care, and she was told that her benefits were being stopped while they were being reassessed in light of that admission to care. And she told us, I'm living out of the freezer now. I'm even turning the electric off, you know, because of heating, because I'm thinking, well, at the moment, I don't really know. And this is well before the current kind of cost of living crisis. But what we were seeing is how these delays were, if anything, intensifying inequalities, intensifying inequities between the carers and people living with dementia. So I just wanted to end by outlining some initial recommendations and learning from the study. I think one of the key things that we learned was, even though we didn't interview workers and practitioners directly, was that a lot of workers were feeling similar pressure on time. They had a kind of a shared experience of that oppressive time. And research by Baines and colleagues into the experiences of home care workers has described what they've called compulsory time philanthropy for people, for home care workers, because they're being put into this position where they're literally having to devote their own free time into meeting their commitments to the people that they're working with. So one of the arguments that we want to suggest is that perhaps the issue here isn't with the provision of care, it's with the wider conditions in which care is provided. And maybe we need to look at what Sarah Sharma calls the temporal architecture of care. So that assemblage of policies and practices and technologies and whatever that lead to this pressure and lead to the kind of the taking away of people's time. Another recommendation that we think is worth considering is in relation to funding models, because at the moment funding is very geared towards kind of individualized, tailored care, which is great when there's the input of care happening, but actually when it's in a context of somebody's care being rationed and whittled and taken away, it can be very disempowering, because then the individual is, if they want to challenge that, has to stand up and deal with the might of the local authority on an individual basis. So one of the things that we're suggesting is perhaps we need to think more collectively about funding and commissioning models that work to kind of mirror what we know about how informal support networks work, and the kind of transactional sharing of time and giving of time that happens within these relationships. And then finally, just to say something very briefly about ethics, and time ethics in particular, and the importance of making that more visible, because we learned at a micro level there's a real ethical dimension to a care worker walking into somebody's home and forcing them to rush through their care, rather than adapting themselves to the temporalities of the person in receipt of care. But there's a much bigger ethical issue around promoting social justice and reducing inequity that I think, as care services are beginning to focus upon the individual, they're losing sight of the wider collective in this context. And particularly, I think, around that kind of undervaluing of people's time. If you take into consideration the fact that somebody living with dementia has a life-limiting condition, their time is really precious. But I don't think we're seeing that. I don't think it's being acknowledged in the context of the provision of care. So I think ultimately then what I'm trying to argue here is perhaps we need to make time a lot more visible, a lot more explicit in our efforts to begin to think about reimagining dementia care. Okay, thank you very much for listening. And this is a list of some outputs from the project for anyone who would like to follow up. I'll share my slides with Paul so he can share that with anyone who's interested. All right, thank you. Stop sharing.
Wonderful. Thanks, Richard. Thank you for a really thought-provoking presentation. And I could see that there's already some comments and a couple of questions in the chat box. So already a lot of interest coming through from the audience. We'll come back to that. But I'd now like to move to our second speaker today, Stuart. So let me just introduce Stuart. Here we go. So Stuart Wright is from Brunelcare, and Stuart has worked in the health and social care industry for more than 30 years, starting his journey working with people with learning disabilities and behavioural issues before specialising in dementia care. He's worked with Brunelcare for 20 years, and he is the charity's dementia care lead, responsible for the charity's direction and strategy for dementia care across all areas. And among other initiatives, Stuart has developed and implemented a human rights framework and standard for people living with dementia, introduced and rolled out, titled Fits into Practice, has introduced Namaste Care and established resident of concern meetings. He specialises in the management of BPSD and provides leadership and training for the charity about the importance of person-centred dementia care. And he's going to talk to us today about the FITS, Focused Intervention Training and Support into Practice and Namaste Care. So Stuart, I'll hand the floor over to you. And I'll just clarify, BPSD, borderline personality. No, okay. I was thinking,
thanks a lot, Paul. Behavioural and psychological symptoms of dementia, okay, as opposed to challenging behaviour, all the other labels people like to put on it. Yeah, thanks a lot, Paul.
I'll hand over to you.
Thank you very much. Bear with me one moment while I sort out sharing again. That was fascinating, Richard. I like these ideas around time and the importance of it. So thank you.
Stuart, you're on mute. You're showing your screen, but you're still on mute.
Okay, it's not muted when I come back to you, but it's muted when I turn the slides on.
Okay, interesting.
Try that again.
Try again, and you might need to unclick the mute in the bottom left corner once your slides appear. Actually, I can unmute you. Stay put. So I'm asking you to unmute. No? Okay. Let me just try one other way. Won't be a second.
How's that?
Yes, perfect.
Hurrah.
Over to you. Thanks, Stuart.
The wonders of modern technology. You thought we'd have all got used to it by now, wouldn't you? Okay, so as a dementia care lead for a significant period of time for Brunelcare, mid-COVID, I was looking around to kind of wonder what we could do to help staff when we eventually got out of that period, and being acutely aware of some of the challenges that COVID was presenting our care homes, particularly around the care of people living with dementia. As many of you will be aware, the impact of COVID was significant throughout our care homes. Primarily, the loss of face-to-face learning and development for our care staff, I think, had a very big impact. And of course, we were experiencing a higher turnover of staff, a greater reliance on agency staff. And partly as a result, I think, of people coming and going and leaving and stuff, we did lose a lot of key knowledge and skills. And I was acutely aware that we were reverting almost back to a task-focused care again, losing many of the original person-centered principles that we'd embedded in our care homes. We noted that staff confidence was significantly lower, I think, because certainly senior management team going in and out of care homes was less due to outbreaks. I think that lack of support had a big impact on staff's confidence. The quality of training delivered virtually, I certainly noted, delivering it virtually myself, that the level of engagement from carers, although they tried really hard, sat in front of a screen, was really quite challenging for them, and there wasn't the same sense of interaction with the care staff, and you couldn't really easily do experiential exercises and create and generate empathy and real connection with some of the challenges around dementia care. And of course, that also led to a lack of follow-up in terms of what was being delivered and the expectations as a result of that training. And clearly it led to much poorer outcomes for many of our residents and significantly low staff morale. So I think sort of in 2021, I was considering, number one, my own personal development as dementia care lead. I recognised that there were probably, we'd had a major reliance on Kitwood's work in terms of a person-centred approach. And I was starting to realise that Kitwood's work was fantastic and it underpins everything without a doubt, but maybe something was missing. In a more modern world with greater expectations, we know more now, we're in a much better position. There's a massive body of work. I mean, Richard's is one example in terms of time, thinking about how valuable time is. Ideas around citizenship and equity as opposed to just endowed equality, I think it was really starting to challenge me. And so I looked around to kind of educate myself a little bit more. And I came across Worcester University, the Association of Dementia Studies, and their programme for a postgraduate award in expert practice, which was all linked to what you're seeing on the screen now, fits into practice, focused intervention, training and support. It was developed by the Association of Dementia Studies at Worcester University. It sought to bridge the gap that had been identified by between research and practice by Fossey and a number of other people. I think researchers often struggle. They do some incredible work, but it's very difficult to translate it directly into practice. So just that initial description really piqued my interest. And I wanted to get us back on track in terms of embedding a person-centered approach. I realized we had gone back partly due to remote prescribing around BPSD. Antipsychotic prescribing had risen. And I felt that we needed to provide more evidence-based tools to support more psychosocial interventions that were far more wide-ranging than what had simply been used previously, which was a little bit more activity, a little bit more engagement. I just felt we needed more. And the Fits into Practice module appeared to offer that. So it was my first foray into academic study, which I personally thoroughly enjoyed. But what was exciting was it gave me the opportunity not to follow a prescribed set of learning, but in my view, it gave me a framework in which to hang it on. And it also gave me the option to kind of examine what could happen for a care home opened at the beginning of a pandemic with a brand new staff team who'd not had any face-to-face training. They'd had very little direct support. And there was a great deal of, obviously, absence of family visitors at that time. Gave me the opportunity to examine a tailored program to look at delivering it over an extended period of time. So not just 1 or 2 days training, but extended period of time where you got the opportunity to build on carers learning. I think we often underestimate care workers and their ability when supported to really critically think and to apply, what might be perceived as quite complex ideas. So I felt it was really important to give them the opportunity over a period of time, not only with learning and development, but with things like reflective diaries, opportunities to look at evidence-based practice, to look at research, and to tailor it directly to their experience, and more importantly, to the lived experience of people in our care homes. So yes, it did focus on the basics of a person-centered approach, but over time, we pushed that out because we were able to, having those care workers regularly attending sessions over 9 months and having one-to-one support. We pushed the boundaries in terms of citizenship, looking at lifestyle, life choices, and more important aspects of people's lives in the care home, as opposed to simply looking at needs. Although FITS predominantly was developed to reduce antipsychotic use and focus predominantly on psychosocial interventions for people, it gave me the flexibility to add in different modules for the various different workshops. So it was interesting to see with a group of staff what would happen. A group of staff who come from various other care providers who hadn't been introduced to our expectations as an organisation very well, and who had been very, very isolated from the outside world in many ways as a result of the pandemic. So part of the aim of FITS, and certainly my passion would be and was creating dementia care coaches. There's evidence out there that care staff learn best from each other. I think our worry is that sometimes maybe they don't learn all the good things. But this was a real opportunity to harness the passion of many of our care staff and to give that a direction, to enable them to coach and teach their colleagues on a moment by moment basis rather than dragging people out into a classroom. I think certainly my experience as a trainer is you can deliver some amazing training. People are incredibly enthused, go out of that room wanting to change the world. And within 2 weeks, they've kind of gone, it's too hard, because of the lack of that ongoing support. So it made it a lot easier to support staff to learn from each other really good stuff. The care staff obviously are more accessible to each other. They're far more practical. They are able to put things into practice and show each other. And when things go well and things work, they are so excited to share it with each other that actually it has a knock-on effect in terms of creating more positive practice. So very practical. Carers respect each other and they listen to each other. They understand that they're all doing the job. They're all in the same boat. So actually they're more open to learning from each other. I think the other thing is that carers provided their own evidence. It wasn't just from, oh, we were told in training. They were actually devising their own evidence, going away from a workshop, putting things into practice and then sharing it with each other, which grows that positive attitude and grows that really positive practice. And of course, ongoing support has got to be key to this. It's hard work, isn't it, working in a care home? There are massive expectations. There are the pressures of time. And I think certainly during COVID, the sense of isolation experienced by everybody working and living in a care home was really quite untenable at times. So that support became vital and an opportunity for carers as part of the FITS programme to be able to discuss their successes and their challenges and to really find for themselves with support solutions to what they felt at times was really almost too difficult. So yeah, one of the primary outcomes was creating dementia care coaches. And some of the photos that you're seeing are of information boards created by the first FITS cohort that are now up in this particular care home's training room. So it's accessible for everybody else. Obviously, BPSD, understanding behaviours and psychological symptoms of dementia, is a core part of our work in care homes. We are reliant at the moment on external prescribers who do follow a pathway, but are often quick, and I say this with the greatest of respect, but are often quick or under pressure to provide quick solutions for people to calm people down, hence the perhaps overuse of antipsychotics. What we needed to do was create a workforce, and certainly via our coaches, of staff that were confident around BPSD, really understanding that behaviour is a communication of unmet need and really putting it in that context, rather than what often happens is that behaviours can be internalised by the person on the receiving end. And so it becomes a challenge, it becomes difficult, people become labelled. It was about moving away from all of that and really helping carers understand the whole person, and not just in terms of their dementia or other comorbidities, but actually understanding that person's whole life. And again, not just the life story bit, but what was important to that person. Who have they been? Who are they? Who do they want to be? And understanding people with living with a dementia in the context of they still have hopes, dreams and aspirations. To really see a person as still autonomous, but requiring perhaps some support to achieve that autonomy and to provide their own self-direction. Carers have been taught how to use the Newcastle model from start to finish, which has been really, really useful as part of the FITS programme. they have a much better idea now in terms of documentation, of looking for patterns, and then, you know, having the courage to go, what if we tried this with this person, bringing together knowledge about that person in the present, but also now starting to integrate families where restrictions have been lifted. Families have become very much part of this. Often carers aren't the ones that understand medications in care homes. It's usually the RN and senior members of staff, and carers are often left out of that. And for me, I felt it was really quite important to ensure that care staff understood the action and interaction of particularly heavy drugs like antipsychotics and neuroleptics, so that they understood that these things can help, but quite often they can cause more issues than they help solve, and that actually we and their families and the person themselves are more about part of the solution than it is about medicating. So it created much more supportive environment for those living in our care homes, their families and our colleagues, in order to find solutions rather than focus on a problem, while embracing the whole person. One of the things that was missing from Worcester's FITS programme was end-of-life care for people living with dementia and their experience of distress and unmet need. So I looked at Namaste Care, created by a lady called Joyce Simard, which was primarily focused on end-of-life care. But what was interesting, when we introduced this, simply by a video to the FITS group, and they were shown the video in the morning and they were told, here's some stuff, bubble machine, sensory equipment, go away and create your own Namaste session in the afternoon. It was incredible. And I think one of the biggest learnings for me was trust care staff. Once you've given them knowledge and information, trust them to do the right thing with it, because they created the most amazing session that afternoon. And they've gone on and they've really run with this idea of Namaste Care to the point where not only is it used for everyone in this care home at end of life, as you can see from a couple of the photos, people are brought into more communal areas in their beds so that they actually get company and they can comfort each other, as well as having various sensory experiences. We've used Namaste to welcome families back into regular visiting in the care home. And that's been particularly successful because I think after that long period of separation, enforced separation, families felt they didn't know their loved ones very well anymore. Lots of changes had happened, and you know, it was almost like, what do I do with this person now I've come to visit? And the staff embraced Namaste and used Namaste as a way of reintroducing the residents and their families in a very relaxed, social, yet compassionate environment. Alongside that, Namaste isn't just about a massage and some bubbles and some music. It's also about introducing, in a very relaxed way, elements of personal care. So people who hadn't had their hair washed for quite a long time because they couldn't cope with it, as part of their Namaste session, were having their hair washed. Food and fluid was introduced, but not in a traditional way, in a more interesting way. So different fruits, different tastes, themed opportunities in terms of lots of fish and chips and the smells of the seaside. And what we discovered was that people's food and fluid intake increased quite dramatically, simply because they were in an incredible relaxed environment created by the staff. And that was pretty impressive. And I think, you know, for all our care homes, Namaste is going to become a significant feature, simply because it feels different. And I think what's been interesting is skeptical staff who were not part of the FITS program initially would bring people experiencing distress and PTSD to the Namaste sessions and watched the change in people. And I think it's become not only about end-of-life care and increasing food and fluid intake, but it's become a place where people who are distressed or stressed or just need to be in a different environment, who perhaps we've had on behavioural monitoring charts and stuff, have come along to Namaste sessions and they have relaxed. We've had increased reports of increased sleeping through the night. People are much more relaxed following a session. So really positive impacts for people. And in fact, one resident I know was, he'd gone in the morning, he'd enjoyed a lovely massage, went back to where he lives, had his lunch, and asked if he could come again in the afternoon to the second session. And the staff said, of course you can, you know, would you like a massage, would you like a drink, etc. And he went, no, I'd just like somewhere I can be with my thoughts. And I think that really summed up what the guys are now providing through Namaste Care. It's not just about interaction, it's about a space just to be. Care homes can be horribly busy, noisy environments where nobody seems to get any peace. And what they've managed to generate is a place where everybody's welcome and everybody can just breathe and be. Alongside all of that, measurable outcomes. So we did use quality of life tools. We've used obviously our own internal measures in terms of quality assurance and things like safeguarding reports, etc., falls and stuff. And what we found is that the mealtime experience across the whole home as a result of the dementia care coaches has improved significantly in terms of choice, freedom of where to eat, how to eat. There's no prescribed way anymore, which is lovely. However individual residents want to enjoy their meals, that's okay. There's a much wider range of choice, which has led to increased food and fluid intake as well. In terms of using tools around individualized well-being, we've noted definitely increased signs of well-being in probably 98% of all residents, with residents' confidence and independence increasing, even those perhaps who have never reached out for anything before beginning to reach out, happy to accept. One of the photos, the gentleman in the photo finds it almost impossible to receive any kind of touch or comfort. In an individualized Namaste session, he accepted it and now actually asks for it on a day-to-day basis, which is brilliant. We've seen a reduction in falls, and we've seen a reduction in safeguarding and issues and complaints, which I think, you know, we can attribute quite confidently to the impact the dementia coaches have had on their colleagues. I think what they've done is managed to enthuse everybody and be able to show that there's a different way of doing things for people with the dementia. And when you give people freedom and autonomy and you respect their rights, their lives, then actually it becomes a much happier place. And people are more willing to engage, more ready to engage. And actually the staff's enthusiasm for that, I think there's a real pride in their work, which has been brilliant to see. I think a lot of pride had left during COVID, and that really has come up. And I personally am incredibly proud of this group of staff. We've noted greater inclusion, not only of residents, but recognising that every single colleague in the care home is important to a resident's experience. And I think, you know, alongside that, obviously, of family members as well. In terms of self-reporting from staff, we've had them saying that, yeah, they've increased in their confidence. They feel their skills have improved. They're thoroughly enjoying the ongoing development that's been supported by the dementia care coaches. And updates are planned for each cohort of coaches that go through the FITS programme. So the learning doesn't stop, and the support doesn't stop either, which I think is key to making sure you embed new ideas and introduce new research that's evidence-based to care staff for the benefit of everybody in that care home. I think another thing that we're really pleased about is the staff morale has at times gone through the roof. It's definitely much improved. And my inbox is often on a daily basis having emails, little emails from staff saying, I did this, I did that. So their communication and their willingness to share and celebrate what they're doing, I'm really pleased with. I can't say that enough, really. I think we've also had a lot of feedback from relatives. We've noted that relative satisfaction has improved. I mean, alongside the reduction in complaints, I think that's quite a significant step forward for this new home. And it's in a much better place 9 months on. And obviously the lifting of restrictions has helped that. But I think the welcoming back of relatives, I think, has just been made all the more special because staff are sharing their knowledge with relatives to enable better visits to happen, greater understanding, etc. To the point where a number of relatives have bought sensory equipment for their loved ones to have on a one-to-one basis in their own room. So pretty pleased with that. So what's next? Well, we now have FITS cohorts underway in all our care homes, so I am pretty busy and will be for the next 6 months. We've reduced time in terms of the initial 12 workshops to 6 months. Hopefully COVID won't impact that again. I've already adapted it for our community services and 2 cohorts literally this week successfully completed. And we have actually, interesting with what Richard was talking about, we had great discussions around time and the use of time in our domiciliary care, and that did come up a lot. So their FITS cohorts were tailored to them, and there are more cohorts planned. Next year, we are adapting the FITS approach for our ECH sites and our housing sites. Obviously, not everybody is going to be talking about the mealtime experience, so it will be tailored to their needs and the needs of those that they are providing a service for. Because there is only one of me across the organisation, it's been an opportunity, particularly for 2 colleagues who've been identified, to start the FITS university model, and they hopefully will be up and running by 2023, so that we underpin the whole moving forward of us as an organisation, as a truly dementia-friendly organisation right across the board. And so, yeah, we anticipate a full rollout across all our areas, but tailored specifically to meet the needs of those receiving service in those areas. It's been an interesting process because initially you get a manual, the FITS manual from the university, which isn't overly prescriptive, but it obviously has a direction in that it's really focused on behaviours and reduction of antipsychotics. I think for me, it sparked an opportunity to look at how we deliver dementia care training across the organisation and to use FITS as a framework. And to utilise the evidence base that goes along with FITS to create a programme of learning and development that doesn't stop and doesn't just get refreshed, but that it's actually ongoing. I think for the sake of the lives of people living with dementia that we support, we have to become more responsive. We have to take much more account of the amazing research that's out there and the body of evidence around dementia and how to support people to actually find their own power and find their own voice, and to be able to live lives that are meaningful for them and not defined by what we think is okay and not restricted by stuff like commissioning, etc. So for me, it's been an incredible experience. It will be written up at some point.
Sorry to interrupt, Stuart. We're just about 5 minutes over. Is it okay?
Oh, I'm so sorry.
It's okay. I'm just conscious of time, that's all.
And I thought I was only going to be 10 minutes. Yeah, okay. Thanks for listening. Apologies for running over time.
No apologies necessary. You've got a lot of fascinating things to share and some great practice coming through from Brunelcare sites. So thank you very, very much.
Pleasure. Let me just close this.
Sure. Great. Thank you. To finish, we have a 10-minute presentation from Emily Dodd. Emily Dodd is a research fellow in the Centre for Public Health and Wellbeing at the University of Western England and will present some research from the ADAPT study, which is, the full title is South Asian Dementia Diagnosis Pathway. This study is funded by the National Institute for Health and Care Research, and the project sets out to create a set of online resources of culturally appropriate assessments and interventions for supporting people from South Asian communities at various stages across the dementia care pathway. So Emily unfortunately can't be with us today. She's at an awards event, but she's very kindly recorded a 10-minute presentation, which we'll play now. There may be some black boxes on the screen. We've had some interesting time trying to get rid of those. We haven't succeeded, but we think you can still see and hear the bulk of the presentation. So please bear with us on that. And we're just going to play the video now, and then we'll open up for Q&A.
Hello, I'm Dr. Emily Dodd, Research Fellow at UE Bristol, and today I would like to present the ADAPT study. Funded by the NIHR, Research for Patient Benefit funding, the ADAPT study has developed an online toolkit of enhanced interventions to support people living with dementia from South Asian communities across the dementia pathway. The project began in January 2021 and completed in March 2022. I was the project manager for this study. I'm sorry I am unable to attend the forum and I am presenting a pre-record, but the ADAPT study has been shortlisted for the Innovate Awards, so all being well, at the time you are watching this, I should be on a train to London to attend the ceremony. Today I'm going to provide a quick overview of the ADAPT study, who is involved, why we decided to embark on this project, how we went about this, and a little bit about the website or toolkit that we have developed. I will also give you an update of what we are planning next. This is a collaborative project between UE, the Universities of Bradford, Wolverhampton and Bath. Our charity partners on the project include the Race Equality Foundation and the Dementia Alliance for Culture and Ethnicity. Bristol, North Somerset and South Gloss, BNSSG, is the host organisation. We have also continued value support input from the 2 public contributors from the South Asian community who have experience of caring for a loved one with dementia. So why this project? So we know from the current evidence base that roughly 25,000 people from ethnic minorities communities live with dementia in the UK, and the largest single grouping are people whose origins are from South Asian countries. People from South Asian countries communities are at greater risk of developing dementia compared to the white population. However, they are less likely to access all points of the dementia care pathway, and when they do, are more likely to present in crisis or at a later stage in their condition. They also have a different experience of service use. So symptoms are more likely to be missed or misinterpreted, and they are less likely to have access to appropriate treatment. There is also a greater reliance on the community groups for support. Often these are not dementia specific, and therefore staff and volunteers may not necessarily be specifically dementia trained. Given all this, South Asians are therefore disadvantaged compared to their white counterparts, and therefore multiple interventions are required to ensure people from South Asian communities have equitable access to dementia care services via an enhanced dementia care pathway. So then the purpose of this study is to create an online toolkit of culturally appropriate assessments and interventions that support people from South Asian communities across the dementia pathway. There are 3 main work packages to the study. I will provide more detail on these in a minute. Work package 1 and 2 were conducted in parallel during the first 6 months of the project, and the third during the last part of the project. We were also fortunate to be awarded some additional funding to produce an extra film and create animations of the outputs from the first half of the work in work package 2. Work package 1 focused on identifying materials for inclusion on the toolkit. In the first phase of this work package, we carried out a rapid review to identify assessments and interventions that have been culturally adapted and developed for people from South Asian communities. We also searched for and reviewed culturally adapted dementia awareness raising information. Our public contributors were instrumental in working together with us to review these documents. In the second phase, we took the information we'd gathered to a series of workshops with a number of stakeholders to discuss our findings from the review and to identify what were the important materials to add to the toolkit. We know from previous research that people from South Asian communities often draw upon support from small community-led organisations. Working with large organisations such as the NHS is important to ensure people receive the best possible care and support. Where these collaborations work well, they enable the resources of health and social care professionals to be used effectively by taking into account the language, spiritual and cultural needs of different communities. However, sometimes it is not always easy for organisations to work together, given the different approaches and priorities that these different organisations face. One aim of our study was to identify what these tensions were and to find ways of overcoming these. In the first phase of Work Package 2, we developed a series of short stories or vignettes to illustrate some of the challenges of working together, from drawing on the previous research on this topic and carrying out our own interviews with people working in small and large organisations. In the second phase, we used these vignettes in a series of workshops with a number of different stakeholders to identify some possible solutions and recommendations to overcome some of the challenges posed in the vignettes. Our steering group suggested the vignettes we developed could be a useful training tool, so with the extra funding we received, we have created the vignettes into animations which can be used to generate further discussion. Previous research shows using videos is a successful way of facilitating communication. Our charity partners, the Race Equality Foundation and DACE, worked with the team at Flexible Films to video interview our 6 participants who agreed to take part in Work Package 3. The 4 short films created capture the main issues that were identified in the previous 2 work packages. These films can be found throughout the toolkit. So this slide here shows the map or the overview of the final website or the toolkit. The toolkit is split into 2 main sections. You can see that the care pathway section has the elements from the findings from Work Package 1. The Working Better section was developed from the findings in Work Package 2 and provides recommendations to different stakeholder groups at how to improve partnership working between small and large organisations. During conversations in our steering group meetings, we discussed that the voice of the carer, and in particular the female carer, was particularly absent in the toolkit and the films created in Work Package 3. With the additional funding, we commissioned Bluebell Films to work with us and our public contributors to create a film to this effect. This film is on the homepage of the website to represent some of the challenges faced by South Asian carers. It is a powerful and emotional film, and the team are very proud of it. So how do you access our toolkit? Well, you can go directly to the website at the address on this slide, or you can scan the QR code. So what next? What are we doing for the rest of this study team? We are organising a dissemination event on Thursday the 13th of October. If you'd like to find out more about this study and the website, then please do register for this event. The link to register is on this slide. We have also been planning a follow-on study to identify and work with a number of sites that would be interested in evaluating and implementing areas of the toolkit in their organisations. And finally, our review identified a lack of culturally adapted psychosocial post-diagnostic interventions. So we've been exploring the possibility of adapting and piloting a culturally and linguistically version of cognitive stimulation therapy, or CST. I want to leave the last word to our public contributors on their perspective on the toolkit that we have produced. So one of them said, "If I as a carer had come across this toolkit at the start of this awful journey, it would have helped me to navigate my way around the system. I hadn't been made aware of the services and support by any of the professionals after Mum's long-awaited diagnosis." Another quote focuses on the female perspective again. This was very strong from our public contributors. "It is really important to show the female perspective and the importance of not making generalisations about people." And finally, this toolkit will help shine a light for people who have been scrambling around in the dark. Thank you for listening, and apologies again that I'm unable to be presenting live today. Please do contact me or the team email if you have any questions or queries about our project. I may see some of you on the 13th of October if you are able to join us for that event. Many thanks.
And a really big thank you to Emily and her colleagues, and we wish them all the very best at the awards ceremony happening right now this afternoon in London, so fingers crossed. I popped in the chat box a link to the ADAPT study on the Race Equality Foundation website if people want to check out the toolkit and the films that Emily mentioned and highlighted. Okay, well, we've got some time. We've got about 20 minutes of the rest of the session. Just to go back to our first two presenters, Richard and Stuart, and for people to pose some questions. And I'm just going to go to the chat box first. I know, that, Richard, there were a couple of questions aimed at you. There was a comment from Melanie about occupational therapists and their role in terms of assessing and investigating meaningful activities. And some questions from Trish about the interviews that you were conducted and their kind of distribution. And a question from Kay Libby about how the research has informed commissioning of social care services in Stirling or elsewhere. So would you like to respond to some of those points, some or all or one?
Yeah, sure. I mean, just to agree really with Melanie about the role of occupational therapists. I mean, I think there's a lot of a very relevant learning from the Neighbourhoods project that feeds into what it is that OTs do on a day-to-day basis. They're really concerned with issues of occupation. And there's this really interesting idea that's come from a OT perspective about occupational injustice. So for people with dementia, which is this kind of prolonged experience of being underoccupied that people face both in care homes and in the community as well now. So I think there's, it's very relevant area of practice. In terms of the interviews that we did, we were working in 3 areas: in south of Sweden, in a place called Östergötland, in the greater Manchester area, and then in the kind of central belt area of Scotland. So from Stirling across to Edinburgh in one direction and Glasgow in the other. And we tried our best to get as much of a mix of men and women as we possibly could. So there were perspectives from people from different parts of the country, and obviously from both men and women. Lower numbers of people from Black and minority ethnic groups, and only 1 or 2 people from LGBT communities. And that is in fact one of our biggest challenges, was trying to make connections with a more diverse mix of participants, which is something that we need to kind of look at as we do the next stage of the work. But in terms of informing social care, that's really what we're hoping to do. We're pulling together the recommendations into a report at the moment, and we would love to see there was some impact or thinking around some of these issues for social care commissioning, because I think that it brought to light things that have remained fairly, not hidden, and fairly invisible when it comes to the actual organising of care. So thanks for that question, Kay.
Thanks, Richard. And there's a comment from Anna about some of the challenges that the care workforce experience and the undervaluing of carers in that workforce on a number of different levels. I don't know whether yourself or Stuart want to comment on that, respond to that.
Yeah, I mean, I think the time element of that, as Stuart also acknowledged, is really key, because there's this kind of press on people's time as frontline workers, and it's very significant. And I just thought that phrase, compulsory time philanthropy, really captured it well, because it's, they're giving their free time, but it's not a voluntary thing a lot of the time. People are being coerced to give their time as care workers, and I think that that's something that we really need to look at, because a lot of it is to link to the way that rotas are set up and how many visits are crammed into a person's shift and things like that are really having that kind of impact. So we need to kind of unpack that a little bit. But I'm sure Stuart can offer a perspective from a kind of a residential environment.
Yeah, I mean, I'm really sorry that that's in Anna's experience. It is hard and it is challenging, without a doubt, in care homes, and our carers, particularly, are one of our biggest assets. And I think as a view as an organisation is that, you know, we took the steps to introduce this way of working in terms of learning and development. And what I can say is that the way it's been received by our carers is they don't feel as Anna has described, but I think we as providers, as managers, as senior management team, we have to take that on board and recognise that staff do need a lot of support in order to deliver what is often very complex care delivery, both in domiciliary care and in residential care. And I think part of what we introduced on FITS was we deal with the BPSD for the resident, or actually in the community now because we've rolled it out there, but we need to support our carers separately. And I think as an organisation, we've taken steps to also value that role financially. So I'm sad that not all providers take that view, but I think I can only speak from our experience.
Thanks, Stuart. And there's a question from Sally, actually, if I can stay with you, about improving staff morale. Has the investment in the FITS training also translated into retaining care staff? Which now is a big issue.
I think if I look at anecdotally what all of the participants and the new cohorts that we're just starting, I think yes. I mean, I think learning and development is a really important part of valuing care staff. There's the whole debate going on above us, isn't there, about funding social care, etc. Our job as providers and managers is to support the staff in that and to offer opportunities and to value everything that they bring into their role. And part of my job is to bring that out and give permission to bring who they are into work, because that's a vital part of dementia care. So yes, I think I can confidently say, given some of the conversations I've had in the last 2 weeks, this training has and will continue to support retaining our care staff and building a resilient workforce, which I think is something that's key at the moment. So yeah.
And Stuart, I'll pick on you again. There's another question from Kay about the FITS. So is FITS something that Brunelcare could consider selling to other care providers or sharing? I'm not sure if one of those words, maybe both.
I think we can discuss it. Currently, I've got a local authority after me as well. What I would recommend is it's worth the investment in sending someone. It's a distance learning course with Worcester University. It fits into practice. It's postgraduate award. Oh, you can go on and do the certificate and the master's. However, I have adapted it and I'm open to conversations. Yes, I'm open to conversations. Because I think, you know, if a provider finds things that work, we probably should be sharing it because it's about the benefit of the people that we're serving. And so personally, I'm hoping my CEO is not on here. Personally, I'm not precious about it. So yes. Oh no!
That's all right. We can edit it out later.
Thank you.
And there's a comment, Richard. Anna Briggs has given a helpful suggestion about a Caribbean Social Forum. That they're doing lots of work around pilot projects and partnerships around dementia, and perhaps could be a good resource in terms of gaining access to, building up relationships with people from Black and minority ethnic communities.
Yeah, thank you very much, Anna. I'll follow that up. It looks really interesting. Thank you.
Are there any other questions that people wanted to share with Richard and Stuart? Judith, are you happy to unmute and share?
Yes, I just maybe I got it wrong in the beginning, but it seemed to me that you said South Asian people are more prone to dementia than others. And I just wondered, is the research going into why?
So I think, Judith, was that from Emily's presentation?
Oh, it may have been.
Yeah,
Yes.
yeah. So
Ah,
unfortunately,
yeah,
Emily's not here.
yeah. Sorry.
I don't know
I
whether
just,
any of our panel feel like they're informed enough to speak to that. But
I mean, I think that's the really fascinating and interesting and valuable thing to find out.
yeah.
There's a report, I can't remember who it's from just yet, but very recently there was a report published that showed this disparity, not just for South Asian, but for different BME groups compared to the white population in the UK, and it echoes findings already from North America. So there's definitely research that's going on there, but it's a very complicated issue to unpack, I think, and not all about cultural considerations. I think it's also about
genetics.
yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks, Richard. Thanks, Judith. Any other questions from the audience? Comments? Oh, Judith's got another question. That's fine, Judith, go for it.
Sorry. Can you tell us, do you know anything at all about this new medication for dementia that's being talked about, that's meant to affect the early stages and therefore presumably prolong the period when the worst happens?
Well, speaking personally, I probably only know as much as you do at this stage. I mean, it's certainly more promising than a lot of the drug trials, but it is still clinical trials, and there's a big leap to then prescribing it to a wider population and seeing an impact. But it definitely looks as though there's some kind of slowing there, which is a really promising beginning, because they've had a lot of false starts with dementia medication in the past. So yeah, it could be a promising development.
There's a really good question in the chat by Nicola. Paul?
Oh yes, yep. About why is dementia not classed as a physical illness when it comes to paying for care homes? Maybe Stuart, you can help us out with this one.
I don't know.
That's
and
okay.
I'll just be really honest. I don't know. It's Department of Health classifications. It is something that frustrates everybody because we are dealing and supporting people with physical needs that are directly related to their health. I do not understand why it is not part of health. I genuinely don't. That's a question for the Department of Health, I'm afraid. I'm really sorry, I can't answer that.
Any other questions? Stuart, I was just thinking about some of the themes coming out of Richard's presentation, and I wondered about what work's been going on in Brunelcare around, has there been some focus around how you might extend time that carers can spend with residents with dementia and their carers, and how have you been able to enable that?
Yes, I think it's interesting. Richard talks about perception, and I think that is very much where the way that I come at it. It is about perception. It is about the whole. Certainly in the care home, we have the whole day, and so it's about let that day be led by those people that you're caring for. So there's different ways of deploying staff to ensure that the time is maximised. We have a homemaker role that maximises time that is available for more social activities. But I think our view, and mine certainly, is that it's everybody's business in terms of creating time. And if something, it's about going at the person's pace and being led by that person. And I think a lot of our job is about giving staff permission that that's okay. Yeah, because otherwise there is this concept that I've got to get everybody washed and dressed. And I think staff drive themselves because they are conscious of other people's needs. So therefore, the first person, it's very quick because I've got to get to the next person. Oh, and then I've got to get, and it's like, no, let's pull back from that. Let's kind of go, this person needs you for this amount of time to do whatever. So I think for me, there's a lot of permission giving that needs to be done, so that we take those drivers away and give staff permission to be with the people that they're providing care and support. Obviously, there are challenges around staffing levels currently, and I can see that COVID's going to impact us again, possibly, which will impact that time thing. But I think for me, it's about maximising the use of the time that they've got with the people that they've got, and being led by that person rather than being led by, we've got to get lunch, we've got to do this, we've got to do that. We have equipment in place that means just because lunch arrives at 12:30, it doesn't have to be served at 12:30, and a person doesn't have to have their lunch at that time. And absolutely, yeah, I've just seen Sally's comment. It's about that permission giving and supporting staff to value social interaction and see every opportunity as a social interaction. So even if you are supporting someone with what might be perceived as a task, that's an opportunity to be with that person, to explore that person, the task becomes almost secondary, if that kind of makes sense. And it's interesting that the FITS cohorts for domiciliary care, we've spent a lot of time in the last week talking about the utilisation of time and what commissioners put is expected. And so what we're doing is saying that might be what a commissioner expects, but we'd rather be led by the person that we're visiting. So it's also about our managers going back to commissioners and going, no, I'm sorry, this is not the way in which we work. Now, yeah, that's a big step for I think any provider, but that's certainly been what's come out of the FITS cohorts in community, that we will be more vocal about the needs of the person rather than we want them washed, dressed and medicated. It's like, no. We will look at the risk around washing, and if actually there's no risk and no requirement in terms of risk benefit for that person to have full personal care, for example, and the person would rather make their own breakfast, then let's do that instead. But it's also about assessing risk, isn't it, in the moment? So that's a big part of our learning and development for care staff. So I think that partly goes to what Julie's just said as well, because within the ECH environment, the extra care environment, commission time visits similar to domiciliary care, it will be about risk assessing and supporting carers to make risk-based judgments in terms of actually what would this person really like with this time, and we will be standing up to commissioners and families, to be fair, because it's about the person's perception of what they want from their care package, not ours or a commissioner's, quite honestly. I did say that out loud.
Recorded again. Thank you, Stuart. And Pat, I think we've got time to give the last question to you. If you'd like to unmute, or I can unmute you if you prefer.
Fine. Thank you. It's just a quick one. I know a little bit about dementia patients, but I just wonder how many of the patients diagnosed with dementia also have other health problems as well, and how do they impact on the dementia and the care system that you're talking about?
Thank you, Pat. I don't know if one of our contributors wants to tackle that or speak to that.
Well, I mean, just very briefly to say, from my experience of working with people with dementia, it's almost always the case that there are other conditions and what's called comorbidities for people with dementia, and the nature of those conditions changes the experience of dementia and vice versa. And a good example of that would be something like diabetes, which is can often be a precursor to dementia, but managing diabetes in the context of living with a condition like dementia presents all sorts of very specific challenges. So I think there isn't a kind of a stock answer you can give about people as a group, because that's part of the diversity of living with dementia, is how it intersects with other conditions. But I think it's a really important point to raise in terms of the providers' challenges and meeting the needs of such a wide range of people.
Sorry, it's just that most of these conditions are on a sliding scale, if you like. Some are worse than others, or some would, but so the interactions must all be completely different. So you do need a lot more individualized care plans, as you're talking about. Yes, I see that. All right, thank you very much. I just wondered how much the other things impeded the planning.
I think from our perspective, you're absolutely right. I mean, sometimes there's competing needs. And I think we have to prioritize in terms of what the person wants first and foremost, if they're able to tell us, or if they're able to tell us via an advance directive, what is their priority. Obviously listening to family and loved ones. And I think there is that direct impact on quality of life. So it is a constant balancing act and risk assessment, sometimes on behalf of that person if they're not able to make those decisions for themselves. But it certainly adds to the complexity, particularly when you're trying to support someone's choice. For example, in the case of diabetes, quite often tastes change as people progress with their journey, and sweeter things have become more important because they're a comfort. Okay, are we going to stop the person eating sweeter things? No, but we will find a compromise that doesn't send their diabetes off the scale. So it just means we're looking for different compromises to ensure that we retain a degree of quality of life as much as we possibly can and as much as that person would want it. So it's not easy.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Pat. And unfortunately, we're out of time. We've reached the end of our seminar. And all that's left for me to do is to say another massive big thank you to Richard Ward and Stuart Wright and Emily Dodd for 3 fascinating and highly insightful presentations. So yes, a really big thank you. And I can see lots of clapping happening around the screen and applaud. We really appreciate your time and sharing your expertise today with our forum. And it's great to see so many people interested in this topic and joining us today, and some really fantastic questions. We have one more forum meeting this year, and we've pinpointed the 1st of December for that. So we'll circulate more details about that very soon. That'll be our 3rd and final seminar for the year. So please keep an eye out for that. And Jen will also kindly be sharing the link to this